Welcome to the speciation selection topic. The first thing that we need to talk about is variation. So variation are differences within the population, and they can come in two forms: discontinuous variation or continuous variation. Discontinuous variation is controlled by a single gene, and there are no overlaps between the categories. So this could be things such as eye colour or blood group, or when they have a specific category that you fit into. To represent this in a graph, we would draw a bar chart. There should be gaps between each of the bars. So for continuous variation, there are no distinct categories, and the data is always quantitative. So this could be things like height or weight, where multiple genes are controlling that one characteristic. And we call this polygenic. So when we're representing this in a graph, we can represent it as a histogram. The difference between a histogram and a bar chart is there are no gaps between the bars on a histogram. To measure how much variation there is in a population, we look at the genetic diversity. The greater the genetic diversity, the greater the variation. So genetic diversity can be caused by four things: mutation, random assortment, crossing over, and random fusion of gametes. And three of them you've heard of before, and you've looked at in more detail when we've done the meiosis topic. Mutation, you'll look at more detail when you do the mutation topic. So how this links into selection is the idea is the smaller the population, the smaller the gene pool, and therefore the lower the genetic diversity. Or the converse, the larger the population, the larger the gene pool, and therefore there is high genetic diversity. Now the reason this links into selection is that the higher the diversity is, the more likely there could be an advantageous allele. Or looking at the other way around, a population with a low genetic diversity might not be able to generate new advantageous alleles, and therefore will lose the ability to adapt to new conditions. So how this topic links together is the idea that a mutation can cause this advantageous allele, and this is more likely the higher the genetic diversity within the population. So once we have an advantageous allele, selection can occur, and once selection occurs, speciation may occur, which can lead to distinct gene pools, and essentially a new species being generated. But this, as it says, is going to occur over quite a long time period. Where it says many generations, this is the idea that the organism has to breed, and then their offspring has to breed, and then their offspring has to breed, and over and over and over and over. Therefore, it's going to take quite a long time. So looking at selection in more detail, the definition of selection is a process by which individuals are better adapted to their environment and are more likely to have reproductive success and pass on their alleles to the next generation. Now, from this point forward, it is alleles you have to talk about. It cannot be genes, it has to be alleles. Now, there are a few things that cause selection to occur, and we call these selection pressures. So selection pressures could be predation, disease, and competition, all biotic factors that can influence whether a population of an organism is successful or not. So to start with, I'm going to focus on natural selection, and a very common example of natural selection are peppered moths. So we have two examples here. One before the Industrial Revolution, and the other picture represents after the Industrial Revolution. So before the Industrial Revolution, peppered moths used to live on trees which were covered in this white lichen. And for the majority, they used to have a white-coloured appearance and therefore had really good camouflage with the lichen. And because they were hidden, they weren't susceptible to predation. Now, in some cases, mutation has happened, and it could produce a black-coloured moth. And you can see before the Industrial Revolution, the black peppered moth really stands out. There is no camouflage, therefore they are susceptible to predation. So before the Industrial Revolution, the allele frequency for the white peppered moth was very high, and the allele frequency for the black peppered moth was very low because the black ones kept getting eaten, essentially. But then the Industrial Revolution occurred, and you can see that the nice white lichen got damaged, and in fact the trees were covered in a very thick soot, which made the trees have this very dark appearance. Now, when the trees have the dark appearance, you can see that the white peppered moth now stands out really clearly, and the black peppered moth has much better camouflage and therefore is less susceptible to predation. So after the Industrial Revolution, the number of black moths increased because they now have an advantageous allele, and the number of white moths massively decreased because they were susceptible to predation. So mark points wise, when we're looking at general selection, or in other words natural selection, we say variation occurs due to mutation. This can create an advantageous allele where the organisms that have this allele are more likely to survive and reproduce, passing on the allele, so the advantageous allele frequency will increase. So in our example, the mutation caused the black appearance of the peppered moth, and after the Industrial Revolution, this gave them an advantage. They could survive, they could reproduce, passing on the black allele, and therefore the frequency of the black allele will increase, as you can see on the graph on the left-hand side. So there are three types of selection: directional, stabilizing, and disruptive selection. Now the dotted line that appears in each of the graphs is the normal distribution, and you can see how this selection of many generations alters where this normal is. All I mean by normal is where the highest number of that specific characteristic is. So for instance, if we were talking about height and the average height was 5'7", then that's where the peak would be in your graph. So in directional selection, this is where one of the extremes is favoured. Now all I mean is an extreme is one side of that black dotted line, one side of the normal. A common example of this is antibiotic resistance. Imagine on the bottom of your graph you've got a scale of resistance. If one of the organisms is resistant to the antibiotic, then when the antibiotic is used, that bacteria will survive, it will reproduce, and the number of bacteria with the resistant allele will increase. So therefore it will shift to one side. Stabilizing selection, the mean or the average of the normal is favoured, therefore the extremes are reduced. So a common example of this is birth weights. Think about hundreds of years ago. If a baby was too small and was premature, it would be unlikely to survive. Therefore, the smaller side of the scale would have been eliminated. And if a baby was too big, then there potentially could be birthing complications. Therefore, the other extreme would not be favoured. So a normal birth mass or a normal head circumference at birth would be favoured. Therefore, the population would increase for the mean or the average or the normal birth weight or birth head circumference. And finally, for disruptive selection, both of the extremes are favoured and therefore the mean is reduced. And there's not very many examples of this. It's very new to the specification, so there aren't common examples that come up relating to disruptive selection. So speciation is a concept that from one population, two species will evolve. And the definition of a species that you should have learned at AS is that species are organisms that have observable characteristics that are similar, and they are able to reproduce to produce fertile offspring. That's the key. So there are two types of speciation: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. So to start with, allopatric speciation. So you can see we've got one population of insects, and for some reason a river has now separated them. So we call this geographical isolation. And when we have geographical isolation, the individuals on either side are unable to reproduce or unable to interbreed. Now that point 1 is very new information. The rest of it is exactly the same as selection. So we have two populations on the top and the bottom of the river. And each of these populations will be susceptible to their own variation that's been caused by mutation. Now, this variation might have been generated by different selection pressures. The top side might have a lot more grass, the bottom side might have a lot more forest. Therefore, the top side might want to evolve to be greener, and the bottom side would evolve to be a brownier colour. So selection occurs, an advantageous allele will be generated, and those that have the allele will be able to survive, will be able to reproduce and pass on this advantageous allele. The frequency of those alleles will increase. So points 2, 3, 4 and 5 are very similar to what we've looked at already. Point 7 is that what confirms that two species have been created are the fact that if you bring two individuals from the species back together, then they are unable to produce fertile offspring. That's the key. If they cannot produce fertile offspring, they are two different species. If we relate this to a question, it's got increase in temperature causes evaporation and the formation of separate smaller lakes and streams. This leads to a formation of a different species of pupfish. Explain how these different species have evolved. So it's putting all this information about allopatric speciation into a mark scheme. So just running through the mark scheme, we've got geographical isolation. Therefore, there are no interbreeding between the populations of pupfish. Variation occurs due to mutation. There'll be different selection pressures, which means different advantageous alleles will be generated, which will lead to certain organisms being able to survive and reproduce. As they change over many generations, the allele frequency will change. And eventually, if you bring two individuals of the same species together, they will be unable to produce fertile offspring. That last mark point that's on the diagram sometimes occurs in the mark scheme. So it's always a really good idea to add that into the end if you want to make sure you're hitting all the points. So the final example of speciation is sympatric speciation. Now this is the concept that there is no physical barrier between the two species. So you can see here that we've got fish within the lake, and it says after many generations, two parts of the population have diverged. The blue males wander downstream, down to deeper water, are unsuccessful, and the red males that wander upstream are unsuccessful. So the idea is that the blue ones stay near the top and the red ones stay near the bottom. Now this could be for certain reasons, certain selection pressures, but they no longer are interbreeding. So it's the same mark scheme. The only thing that you do not include is mark point 1, where you're saying that there is geographical isolation. For some reason, they are not interbreeding. That's the idea of sympatric speciation.